Wine is not the first thing you think of when you think of the British Empire. However, while Great Britain may not be known for its grapes, many of her colonies would become known for their viticulture. Today, when perusing the shelves of your local supermarket or liquor store, it is not uncommon to find wines from two former British colonies, South Africa and Australia. This month, in Talking History, we speak to Dr. Chelsea Davis, an assistant professor here at Missouri State University, whose research focuses on the British Empire and environmental history. Her doctoral thesis, completed in 2021, charts the history of wine production in South Africa and Australia, and she recently published an article entitled All That Glitters is Wine, Viticultural Capitalists and the Creation of Britain's Colonial Wine Industry, which was awarded Best Article by the Canadian Historical Association. My name is Patrick Needham.
And I'm Gene Badgelin.
And this is Talking History.
Dr. Davis, welcome to Talking History.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, we wanted to begin a little bit because I'm sure our listeners are perhaps not aware of the history of wine production in the British Empire. So, your research focuses on two British colonies, Australia and South Africa, colonies which we often refer to as settler colonies because there were large numbers of people from Great Britain and other parts of Europe who went to settle there. So, can you talk a little bit about the origins of wine cultivation in South Africa and Australia? Obviously these are two different colonies, but does the introduction of the grape and wine production have a similar story in these two colonies, or are there differences?
Yeah, thanks so much, Gene. I would say there are some similarities and differences, and it's important that we start with South Africa first, which isn't South Africa as we know it until about 1910. And so in the 1650s, the Cape Colony, as what we focus on and what's considered a British colony at that time, the Dutch actually colonize the Cape of Good Hope and the Cape Colony. They're really using this as a port city, as a sort of rest station on routes to get to other colonies in Southeast Asia in the 17th century. And so there's a vested interest by a few captains in growing and producing wine in the Cape Colony in South Africa. And so some grapevines are brought, and from an early time, from the 1650s, there's sort of these really rudimentary attempts to grow and make wine, and they're largely a failure. There's a vested interest in sailors, particularly having interest in wine for medicinal purposes. It was thought to treat scurvy. It's something that might keep better on a boat as far as alcohol that can be consumed later on. But in general, it's not until we see an expulsion of French Huguenots leaving Western Europe and actually immigrating to South Africa in around the 1680s, where they bring a lot of their expertise from France to growing and making wine. And it sort of takes off in the 18th century. And it's only when the Cape Colony becomes a British colony in around 1806, more officially in 1815, that this becomes a British colony that grows and makes wine. And so that's sort of the story of South Africa. It's more of an inherited wine industry in that sense. Whereas with Australia, they're actually, this is a British colony that had interest in being a penal colony, right? They were going to dump a lot of their convicts or societal undesirables, so to speak, in Australia to get rid of them in the late 18th, early 19th century. But on that very first ship in 1788, they pick up grapevines from South Africa and bring them on the very first voyage into Australia. And so from the outset, there is an interest in growing grapes and making wine in Australia, and it's something that there was fears, allegedly, by Napoleon Bonaparte that the British were going to use Australia as this great vineyard that would eventually rival that of the French, which we know probably has never happened yet. But in many respects, he was a little bit ahead of his time in that way.
So basically, you have in what would become South Africa, Europeans bringing wine and grape cultivation there, but not the British specifically.
Sure.
But then with Australia, the British are bringing it. But there's a connection with South Africa because they're bringing the plants from South Africa as well. So there's a kind of connectivity between these two projects, even though one was not started by the British and the other one is started by the British.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think this comparative approach works, just because I think these two industries from the outset are inextricably linked, not only from being colonies within the British Empire in the 19th century, but also from their early environmental origins in that way.
Dr. Davis, in your article, you talk pretty extensively about the mineral revolutions in the late 19th century and their impact on the wine industry in South Africa and Australia. Before we get into that question, could you tell our listeners exactly what you mean by mineral revolution?
Yeah, sure. So the mineral revolution is just describing what we see happening on a global scale with gold rushes, diamond rushes, and an interest in mining minerals in a really big and meaningful way. And this is happening pretty much from the 1850s onwards into the 1880s and 90s. And the reason it's a revolution is because it's sort of attached to countries and places in Western Europe that are industrializing at a rapid rate. So they're really looking for raw materials, raw resources, and minerals in particular. And this is sort of like the famous gold rushes that we hear about, whether it's in California in 1848, in Australia starting from 1851, and then later in South Africa with diamond and gold rushes in the 1870s and 80s. But these are happening, on a global scale. And the reason they're also a revolution is just in the how much it pushes immigration on a really, really big scale, the migration of people moving and flocking to these different areas. In the article, I mentioned how one of the individuals who sort of strikes gold in Australia had been at the California gold rushes first. And so we not only see a migration of people, settlers sort of interested in capitalizing on, the mining of gold and striking gold in that way, but also massive migration of labor happening at the same time. People trying to go to the gold fields to work as laborers and ending up staying, or people leaving different industries within their respective areas to go to the mines, which is happening at sort of this local level and also a global scale.
When you talk about the mineral revolution, obviously this is focusing on mining and diamonds and things like that. So we wouldn't immediately assume a connection with the agricultural sector or specifically with the production of wine. But your article makes the case that actually this mineral revolution, one of these knock-on effects of this mineral revolution is the revolutionizing of the wine industry in Australia and South Africa, which kind of follows similar, if not identical, but a similar trajectory following this mineral revolution. So can you talk a little bit about what the effects of the mineral revolution was on wine production, and specifically you mentioned something called viticultural capitalists. Who were they and how did these people transform the wine industry?
So by viticultural capitalists, so viticulture is just the act of growing grapes used for wine, whereas viniculture is the process of making that wine. So really fancy word for those that are growing, doing some wine growing. And these viticultural capitalists I've tried to identify are a specific set of very privileged colonists and that exist within the British Empire and these wine growing colonies who are vested and deeply interested in expanding the industry and making it sort of a commodity that fits within a globalizing marketplace in the 19th century. These are not just like, oh, let's grow wine in our backyard as this idyllic hobby, or, it's a family enterprise. These are people that are interested in really taking things up a notch as far as the wine industry goes. So these are individuals who are these really large-scale wine growers and producers. They're not the mom-and-pop farms. They're more corporatized kind of entities that require a great deal of capital to be able to invest in this project and sort of consolidating land, consolidating the processes. So typically what used to happen in the late 18th and early 19th century in these places, you might be a small farm and you sell your grapes to X, Y, and Z, or you try and make it yourself, and then the barrel gets sent to a merchant who's going to doctor all the wine in that barrel so then it can survive when it gets to London. And then when they open it in London, they're like, this tastes awful. What did you do to it? And that kind of very crude process. And it's really, with this grand scale kind of investment, we have the incorporation of more scientific processes attached to manufacturing that take place, use of technology like big wine presses as opposed to, individuals using their feet to stamp on the grapes. And it takes a great deal of money to do so. And so for me, I'm interested in that kind of broad category of people who are settlers that have a great deal of money and privilege, who are using it to sort of make this a colonial commodity for the empire. And they also have this sort of cultural attachment to wine where they're putting it on a pedestal in a way that it is different than other sort of commodities because of different cultural connotations that they attach to it, whether it's, a drink of civility or gentlemanly like gourmet culture, right? But in particular in this article, there's a specific category of these viticultural capitalists who get their money specifically from striking gold, so to speak, or benefiting from the gold or diamond rushes in Australia and South Africa. And they're not just using that money to, buy a big house or do X, Y, and Z, but they're specifically funneling that money into viticultural expansion. They're going to buy multiple wine farms and make a massive one, or they're going to invest in new technology. They're going to hire a Frenchman from overseas to come and oversee their processes of making this wine. And so they're basically just have access to more money that's able to reinvest in these agricultural processes. And by way of that, a lot of them end up having a great deal of political capital in the colony as well. Money talks in that way, and it's no different in the 19th century British Empire. And so many of them are using that to dictate, labor laws or what sort of taxes and tariffs they're dealing with. And so these individuals are a very privileged, elite, small group of people, I would say.
So they're taking the money and profits that they're getting from the mining industry, and then they're reinvesting it into the wine industry. And one of the reasons they're doing this is because there's a kind of cultural prestige, perhaps, in the wine. And perhaps for them, it's a way to, increase the prestige of that colony that they're living in, or satisfy a kind of demand for a luxury good within the empire. So there's a kind of, they're not randomly investing in wine for no reason, but there's particular cultural reasons why they're taking their profits and investing in wine. It seems like there's a parallel even today with tech billionaires, taking their money from tech and then buying vineyards in California. There seems to be the kind of
I hadn't even considered that, but it's worth, I don't think that's far off from what we're getting at here. And I think that says something about the sort of cultural attachments or you said prestige, but even, I guess, the attitudes or symbolic nature of wine, whether it's in this period related to Christianity or related to some sort of cultural civility in some way, which is in and of itself a colonial, idea. And so, yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons to get invested in wine, and it requires a great deal of capital as well as patience. You can't really make wine in a year and then you have a return on your investment immediately. This is going to take a few years of time to really build it up. And so, yeah, what this article focuses on is that the gold and diamond rushes, some that were successful from it, are actively using it to reinvest in the colonial wine industry in a meaningful way. And a lot of that has to do with believing that this is an important industry to invest in the first place, as opposed to, let's say, sheep and cattle driving or ostrich farming or whatever it might be.
In your piece, you identify a couple of case studies. You have Thomas Hardy in Australia and Cecil Rhodes in the Cape Colonies. Who were these two gentlemen, and how are they indicative of the changes in wine production, and why are they great examples of this, using the capital from the mineral revolution to consolidate and reorder the winemaking industry?
Yeah, thanks for that. Ironically, Cecil Rhodes is probably the more well-known figure. So if you've ever seen kind of there's a really famous political cartoon. I'm not sure if it's Punch that's been done in the late 19th, early 20th century, and it's called From the Cape to Cairo, and it has an individual stretching his toes from Cairo in Egypt all the way to Cape Town in South Africa over the entire continent. And that's supposed to depict Cecil Rhodes, who is this really avowed imperialist who was interested in colonizing a great deal of land and
the founder of the Rhodes Scholarship.
Correct. And so I actually did not know that Cecil Rhodes, despite knowing all of that, in my graduate training about him as a British imperial historian, I did not know that he grew and made wine until I really got into this research for my PhD. Whereas Thomas Hardy, as somebody who's looked at the Australian wine industry for over a decade now, is somebody that's very well known, like as far as attached to wine specifically. When you go to South Australia, we go to the main state library there. They have a Thomas Hardy wine library section. Like it's a very specific, his bottle and name are kind of peppered all over places in Australia. And even if you go to Outback Steakhouse, sometimes you can find a Hardy Wines there. It's worth trying, I would say. So whereas Cecil Rhodes is kind of like more of the surprise. I don't know that a lot of people know, even if they've heard of the name and sort of some of his notoriety as one of a very violent owner of the De Beers mining company and all that entails with diamond mining. He is lesser known with wine production. And so I feel like those two are really interesting case studies for me to focus on from these two colonies because they have different stories and yet so many similarities. Tom Hardy comes to Australia and starts like working in like different farms. He's just, from Devon, an English colonist who's trying to sort of rise up in the ranks, and eventually he goes off to the gold fields and he tries to do some gold mining, and he actually makes more money. I think he opens a butcher like right next to the gold mine because people have to eat. So he makes a ton of money of that, and he uses that to basically then build up his wine growing empire. And he actively just is buying up a great deal of land, and at a certain point invests in like these huge wine manufacturing processes and plants so that he's then buying grapes from individuals from smaller farms. And so he's making the wine there. And that really changes the process. He also becomes very politically involved. He's very well known in the industry. He writes like in multiple different agricultural journals and magazines that are being read by wine growers in Australia and throughout other parts of the empire and the United States. He travels globally. Like he's probably my biggest interest in Hardy is that he kind of bounces around and visits vineyards in France, Germany, Austria, Spain. He goes to South Africa at one point. He's in Algeria and Tunisia. He goes to the United States and California, and he publishes these journals. And so I think he's a very connected person that is very interested in like making Australian wine an equal competitor to many of the Western European wines that exist. And as far as Cecil Rhodes goes, so he comes to South Africa, and I think originally he's trying to, I think he's on like works in Natal, like where there are sugar plantations and different sugar or cotton industries, and he is not enjoying that. He ends up going to the diamond mines and really invests and gets some buddies there to invest in, and they form the De Beers Mining Company, which is, again, sort of notoriously known for really violent labor practices, especially against people of color in this period. And he takes, as he also gets sort of more political capital, at one point he becomes the prime minister of the Cape Colony, sort of the premier of the Cape Colony. He's using that political capital to sort of reward his buddies who are also wine growers. He's buying up more land. He's hiring outside expertise. I think he hires somebody from California to come in and help him. And so he's really trying to, both of them are just trying to make this not just something that's consumed locally, but actually is a good for the empire, and that is exported overseas and actually is consumed overseas. And it's worth pointing out that both of these individuals and their goals, they're not really realized in the time period in which they're living. I mean, South African and Australian wine are very well known in Britain today. You can go to any, as you said, off-license shop or the grocery store and find Australian and South African wine. It's very regularly consumed now. But that's something that really comes about in like the 80s and 90s, 1980s and 90s. So nearly like a century later from when these individuals are having serious influence. But these are sort of the early seeds in starting that industry.
You kind of hinted at this in terms of the treatment of the labor forces that were involved in production. So, before the mineral revolution, a lot of this grape growing is done in small holdings and farms. You don't have these huge plantation-style vineyards created yet. But obviously, with the formation of this corporatization of the wine industry, how is that affecting the people who are already in the business, the small producers, and how is it affecting the people who are brought in to work in these vineyards? What are the conditions like? Who's being brought in to do this work? Is it European settlers, or are they relying, especially in a place like South Africa, on people from Asia or indigenous Africans from South Africa? And how are they being treated?
Yeah, this is a very complex question. And so to clarify, actually, in South Africa from, as I mentioned, when the Dutch sort of take over and colonize and start growing and making wine there, they are using sort of plantation-style vineyards, and they are increasingly, at least from the 18th century onwards, utilizing an enslaved labor force that is predominantly made up of enslaved peoples brought from parts of Malaysia and other Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia, as well as indigenous South Africans, lesser so with the indigenous Khoikhoi and San people, mainly because they were a lot more resistant and they struggled to compel them to be enslaved in that way. And there's a sort of a cultural mixing that happens. So many of the enslaved populations are descendants of, let's say, Southeast Asians, Africans, and the like, by the time we get to the 19th century when this is a British colony. And so the British, when they take over this wine-growing colony, they're still maintaining this system of slavery because it's well-practiced. It's a well-oiled machine that they're practicing in other parts of their own empire, like the Caribbean. And slavery is outlawed in 1834. More officially in 1838, we get kind of a 4-year, what's called an apprenticeship period, where it is enslaved peoples are working for free to learn a trade or skill. I realize I'm using scare quotes here, but you can't see those. And so after 1838, we still require labor to grow and make wine here in South Africa. And so they're largely drawing on a non-white labor force. And these individuals continued to be the majority of the labor force through the rest of the 19th and into the 20th century. Now, that being said, there is a ton of colonial interest, especially on behalf of some of these viticultural capitalists who often complain about the labor force, sort of denigrating the black labor force as being unskilled, inept. There's interest in bringing French laborers, but really struggle to get any French to immigrate to either South Africa or Australia. There is an interest in bringing some Germans in, which does happen to a lesser extent. There's an interest in bringing maybe Spanish or Italians in. Like, this is all really talked about, but when push kind of came to shove in the mid to late 19th century, a lot of this sort of tradition of control seems to take precedent, and desire to pay this, non-white labor force very cheaply sort of takes precedent over quote-unquote skill, which I realize doesn't really account for the people who had been growing and making the wine for a long time, which is this non-white labor force, and many of them are the ones actively doing the work. So I would argue they are quite skilled. Now, in the case of Australia, this is more of like the small holding, like, can your family run this enterprise? Let's have your daughters do it. And increasingly, we do actually see, as a fun fact, some prison laborers being used because it is a penal colony at the government house of Parramatta in like New South Wales very early on. But as this really grows, it's more of like There are a lot of German settlers who are brought in to Australia in particular. There's a huge German community, especially in South Australia, and I talk about this a little bit about this in the article. There's sponsorship of German wine growers to come to Australia. It's sort of the government sponsoring a lot of these ships to get people out. It should be said that many of these German peoples lied that they had any kind of wine experience. They were just trying to get a better life, and so they fled and ended up in Australia. But the interesting thing about labor in both of these examples is, and this is sort of related to the gold and diamond rushes, is the use of Chinese labor, which I touch on sort of briefly in the article. A lot of migration that's happening during the gold rushes, whether in California, Australia, South Africa, leads to a migration of Chinese labor, which, if you know anything even about U.S. history, right, there's a lot of Chinese immigration happening for both the gold rush and the construction of, let's say, the Transcontinental Railroad and that kind of thing. And so there's an interest, like we have this massive influx of Chinese immigrants for a labor source. There's increasingly these viticultural capitalists are like, can we use Chinese labor for wine growing? They're going to phase out of the gold mines shortly, like bring them to the farms. And a lot of that gets attached to something I talk about in other work that I do, is how ideas of skill, particular skills, get attached to racialized labels, i.e., they might say something like, oh, Chinese laborers have really delicate fingers. Let's have them do the picking of the grapes or the pruning or pulling bugs off of vines, and this sort of attitude, which is, we know now, is obviously very problematic. But these are the kind of views and perspectives that these individuals had. So there's a lot of talk about using Chinese labor in the vineyards as well. And I would say Cecil Rhodes in particular, as far as race relation goes, he's among many of the wine producers in South Africa are very interested in maintaining a non-white, predominantly black, controlled labor force. And whether that's the use of prison labor, which again is predominantly black labor in South Africa, or using kind of day laborers who are paid by the day, really, really low wages. And a lot of that has to do with control. I mentioned there's something called the Masters and Servants Ordinance, which is passed in the 19th century and basically permit various types of punishments or brutalities or different types of policies. So basically, Cecil Rhodes is using his political capital to prop up and support acts of legislation or different policies and bills that expand the authority of wine growers and enables them to enact violence or violent policies against their black laborers in the vineyards. And famously, like the Strop and Dop bill, which permitted them to use a whip, right? And this is in the period well after emancipation. And so these sorts of policies can persist, and they are persisting in the growth and production of wine in South Africa. The sort of right to whip your workers, so to speak. And it's worth pointing out that the Masters and Servants Ordinance didn't actually end until 1974 in South Africa. So this is something that persists, and whether or not it's being enacted in this way, it's definitely persistent within the cultural memory of recent generations. And so there is a massive legacy of racialized injustice related to wine cultivation, particularly in South Africa, that is very much embedded into the culture and persisted even in contemporary times today, for sure.
This has been a fascinating conversation, but that is all the time we have this month. Thank you, listener, for joining us for Talking History, and thank you, Dr. Davis. A presentation of KSMU and the Missouri State University Department of History. You can catch us every first Thursday at 12:06 after NPR News. This show is available along with our entire back catalog at ksmu.org or wherever podcasts are found.